Welcome back to Coin Explorer Vault. Because today, an ordinary-looking 2015 Lincoln penny may be carrying a story far more fascinating than its 1 cent face value suggests. The 2015 Lincoln penny is a coin most people would have spent without a second thought, perhaps at a grocery store, slipped into a pocket, dropped into a coffee can coin jar, or tossed into a drawer with loose change. But imagine discovering 1 year later and noticing something that makes you stop the date, the mint mark, the tiny details of the design, and perhaps an unusual characteristic that separates one example from millions of ordinary cents. A claimed figure of $45 million has been associated with this coin in the kind of extraordinary valuation stories that circulate among coin enthusiasts. But let's be very clear, that figure should be treated as a claimed or hypothetical value, not as proof that every 2015 penny is worth millions. So the real question is much more interesting. What would have to be different about a 2015 Lincoln penny for collectors to take a second look? Before we get there, let's go back to the beginning. The Lincoln cent has one of the longest and most familiar stories in American coinage. For generations, Americans have carried Lincoln pennies in their pockets, placed them in piggy banks, saved them in jars, and handed collections down from parents and grandparents to children. Many of us remember being young and looking through a handful of change simply because there was something satisfying about finding an older date. Maybe a wheat penny appeared among newer cents. Maybe a grandparent had a small envelope filled with coins from another time. Those memories are part of what makes Lincoln cents so special. The 2015 belongs to a much more modern chapter of that story, and the D Mint mark tells us that this particular coin was struck at the Denver Mint. Turn the coin over, and you see the familiar Lincoln Memorial-inspired Union Shield reverse used during this period, while the obverse carries Abraham Lincoln's portrait, the date, the word liberty, and the inscription, "I in God we trust." At first glance, there may be nothing dramatic about it, and that is precisely why this coin deserves a closer look. The first clue is the date. If you have a 2015 Lincoln cent in your collection, don't simply glance at the year and put it away. Look carefully. Is the date sharply struck? Are the numbers properly formed? Does anything appear doubled, distorted, unusually spaced, or damaged? Remember, there's an enormous difference between a genuine mint-made variety and damage that happened after the coin left the mint. A scratch, scrape, dent, or flattened letter can make a coin look unusual, but that does not automatically make it rare. This is where patient observation becomes more important than excitement. And this is where the story gets even more interesting. The date catches your attention, but the real clue may be somewhere else. Look beneath the date for the small D mint mark. On a coin this modern, that tiny letter can be easy to overlook, especially when the penny has spent years rubbing against other coins. Check whether the mint mark is clearly struck, whether the surrounding field looks normal, and whether there are unusual features that appear to be part of the original strike rather than later damage. Then examine Lincoln's portrait under good lighting. Look around the lettering, the date, the rim, and the edges of the design. You're not searching for something simply because you want it to be valuable. You're searching for evidence. That distinction is important. A serious collector learns to ask, what am I actually seeing, rather than immediately asking, how much is it worth? But suppose you find something unusual. What happens next? Condition becomes critical. A coin that spent years loose in a pocket may have countless tiny marks, dull surfaces, or worn details. Another example may have been protected almost from the moment it was struck. Collectors and grading services examine factors such as strike quality, surface preservation, luster, color, and overall appearance when determining a coin's grade. For a modern Lincoln cent, exceptional preservation can make a major difference in collector interest. But don't make the mistake of believing that every shiny 2015 penny is automatically rare. Shine alone does not establish rarity. A coin can look bright and still be common, while a genuinely interesting variety may require careful comparison with known examples. This is why collectors sometimes use magnification and reference photographs when examining potentially unusual coins. A small detail that looks mysterious to the naked eye can become much clearer under magnification. But there is another question worth asking: why would anyone care so much about a coin made in 2015? The answer is not simply money. Collectors are fascinated by the possibility that something overlooked could have survived inside ordinary circulation. Think about how many pennies have passed through American hands over the decades. They have traveled through supermarkets, restaurants, vending machines, banks, family businesses, school cafeterias, and countless homes. A penny can disappear into a drawer for 20 years and then suddenly reappear when someone is cleaning out an old house. Sometimes the most interesting discoveries begin that way. Someone opens a forgotten container, sees a handful of old cents, and decides to inspect them instead of spending them. That moment, the moment when an ordinary coin becomes a discovery, is what keeps collectors searching. And if you're watching this with an old collection nearby, perhaps inherited from a parent or grandparent, don't assume that newer coins are automatically worthless. Start with the basics. Find the 2015 date. Confirm the D mint mark. Examine both sides under strong, even light. Check the rim for unusual shapes or signs of a genuine mint-made anomaly. Look for possible doubling in the lettering and date, but compare carefully because machine doubling, wear, scratches, and post-mint damage can create misleading appearances. If you believe you have found something genuinely unusual, photograph both sides and seek an opinion from a knowledgeable numismatist or reputable grading service before accepting an extraordinary valuation. That is especially important when you encounter claims of enormous prices. A $45 million figure attached to a 2015 D Lincoln penny should not be treated as a guaranteed market value simply because it appears in an online story or video. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, a documented variety, a verifiable provenance, a recognized grading result, and credible market evidence. Without those things, the figure remains a claim or hypothetical possibility rather than a promise. But that doesn't make the search pointless. In fact, it makes the search more exciting because now you know what to look for. And just when you think the mystery ends with the 2015 D, there's another Lincoln cent waiting in this journey, one that takes us much further back into American coin history. The 1982 Lincoln penny is where the story begins to change, because the early 1980s were an important period for the Lincoln cent, and the details surrounding that year can make collectors look much more carefully. So if you have an old jar of pennies, don't put away yet. Keep that magnifying glass nearby, because the next coin we examine is the 1982 Lincoln penny, and its date may be more important than you first realize. And remember that 1982 Lincoln penny, because when we turn our attention to it, we're stepping into a fascinating chapter of Lincoln cent history that deserves a closer look. For now, take one more look at your 2015 D penny. Maybe it is completely ordinary, and that's perfectly fine. Or perhaps you've noticed a tiny detail you never saw before. The important thing is that you looked, because sometimes the difference between spending a coin and preserving it begins with nothing more than a few extra seconds of curiosity, and that tiny moment of attention can lead to a much bigger discovery. Next, let's turn our attention to the 1982 Lincoln penny, a coin that may look completely ordinary when resting in your hand, yet the year itself opens the door to one of the most interesting chapters in modern Lincoln cent history. If you have ever inherited a jar of pennies from your parents, found an old coffee can in a garage, or sorted through coins that have been sitting untouched in a drawer since another decade, there's a good chance you have encountered a 1982 cent without realizing how much collectors can learn from it. A claimed figure of $52 million has been associated with an extraordinary 1982 Lincoln penny in speculative coin value stories. But that number must be treated carefully. It is a claimed or hypothetical figure, not a verified value for an ordinary 1982 penny. The real mystery is this: why does the year 1982 make collectors slow down, examine the coin closely, and sometimes turn a simple penny over again and again? The answer begins with a major change in the composition of the Lincoln cent. For much of the 20th century, Lincoln cents were made primarily from a copper-based composition, but rising copper prices created pressure to reduce the cost of producing the nation's 1-cent coin. In 1982, The United States mint transitioned from the traditional bronze composition to the copper-plated zinc composition that would become standard for later Lincoln cents. That means 1982 is not simply another date on the calendar, it represents a transition year. And transition years are exactly the kind of dates that make collectors pay attention. But here's where the story gets more complicated. Not every 1982 penny is identical. There are different compositions, different mint facilities, and different varieties associated with the year. Some 1982 cents are bronze, while later pieces were struck on copper-plated zinc planchets. There were also different date configurations used during the year, creating a collecting challenge that makes the 1982 Lincoln cent especially interesting. So if you find one, don't immediately ask how much money it is worth. First, ask a better question: which 1982 penny do I have? That question can completely change the conversation. Start with the date. The four numbers may look familiar, but look closely at their shape and placement. Then check the mint mark, if present. A 1982 penny without a mint mark was struck at Philadelphia, while a D indicates Denver. But the mint mark is only one part of the puzzle. The next clue involves the coin's weight and composition, and this is where careful collectors can separate one 1982 cent from another. Traditional bronze cents weigh about 3.11 grams, while the later copper-plated zinc cents weigh about 2.5 grams. If you have an accurate digital scale capable of measuring to at least a tenth of a gram, weighing the coin can provide an important clue. But remember, weight alone is not absolute proof of a variety. Dirt, corrosion, damage, scale accuracy, and unusual circumstances can affect measurements. So collectors should use weight as part of a larger examination rather than as the only evidence. And this is where the story gets even more interesting, because 1982 was not just about metal. It was also a year in which collectors became fascinated by different date styles and the possibility of varieties. Some examples have what collectors describe as different sizes of the date digits, and distinguishing those varieties requires close comparison. If you have an old 1982 cent, don't assume the date is merely there to tell you when the coin was made. In this case, the date itself can become part of the mystery. Think about that for a moment. Two pennies can carry the same year, the same portrait of Abraham Lincoln, the same basic reverse design, and yet subtle differences can make them distinct collecting pieces. That is one of the reasons numismatics is so rewarding. The details that most people ignore are often the details collectors study for years. Now, imagine the journey of one of these coins. It leaves the mint in the early 1980s, enters circulation, and begins moving through American life. Perhaps someone used it at a neighborhood store. Perhaps it sat in a cash register during a time when gasoline prices, grocery bills, and postage stamps were dramatically different from today. Maybe a child received it as change and dropped it into a piggy bank. Maybe a mother placed it in a kitchen jar because there was no reason to spend a single cent decades pass. Families move. Houses change hands. That penny remains. And eventually, someone opens the jar and notices the date 1982. Suddenly, a coin that had been invisible for years becomes interesting. But don't stop at the date. Turn it over. Examine Lincoln's portrait. Study the lettering. Look at the rim. Inspect the surfaces under good light. If you see what appears to be doubling, ask whether it is genuine hub doubling or simply damage, machine doubling, or distortion caused by circulation. A true collectible variety must be identified using reliable numismatic references, not wishful thinking. The same principle applies to errors. A damaged coin can look spectacular, especially when a piece has been scratched, struck, bent, or exposed to harsh conditions. But post-mint damage is not the same thing as a mint error. If your 1982 cent appears unusual, document it carefully before drawing conclusions. Take clear photographs of both sides, note the weight, record whether there is a mint mark, and compare the coin with established references. If the coin appears genuinely significant, professional examination may be worthwhile. Condition is another major part of the story. A circulated 1982 cent with heavy marks and worn surfaces may be interesting historically, but not especially valuable. A sharply preserved example with strong detail, attractive surfaces, and a recognized variety can command much greater collector attention. This is why collectors use grading standards rather than simply saying a coin is old or shiny. A coin's state of preservation matters. So does its color designation, particularly for copper-based cents. Red, red-brown, and brown designations can influence how collectors view a copper coin, but color alone does not make a coin rare. Once again, the key is evidence. And if someone tells you that every 1982 Lincoln penny is worth thousands, millions, or some enormous figure simply because it says 1982, be cautious. The year is important, but the exact coin matters. A claimed $52 million value should never be presented as the normal market price of a common 1982 cent. Extraordinary valuations require extraordinary documentation. The fascinating part is that you don't need $1 million coin to experience the excitement of numismatics. The thrill comes from understanding what you are holding. A small copper-colored disc can tell you about manufacturing costs, changing metal prices, American industry, mint production, collecting traditions, and everyday life. And that is why the 1982 Lincoln cent deserves a place under the magnifying glass. But there is one more twist waiting in this sequence. The 1982D Lincoln penny takes the story from a general 1982 mystery to a specific mint mark investigation. That tiny letter D can tell us that the coin came from Denver, and when you combine the year with a mint mark, the search becomes much more focused. So if you have a box of old pennies nearby, don't just search for wheat cents. Look for 1982, then look again for the mint mark. And if you find a 1982D, set it aside rather than spending it immediately. Because the next step in this story is going to be even more specific, and we'll examine exactly why collectors might pay attention to that little d beneath the date. For now, keep your 1982 cents close, examine them slowly, and remember the lesson this coin teaches. Sometimes the most important clue isn't something dramatic. Sometimes it is a tiny change in composition, a subtle difference in a date, or a small letter that millions of people overlooked while simply spending their change. And somewhere, perhaps inside an old family coin jar, another 1982 penny may still be waiting for someone patient enough to notice. Next, let's turn our attention to the 1982D Lincoln penny. And this time, that tiny D mint mark is the first detail you should notice. Imagine finding one inside an old jar that has been sitting on a shelf for decades, mixed among wheat cents, modern pennies, and coins nobody in the family remembers saving. At first, it looks like just another worn Lincoln cent. Then you notice the date 1982, and beneath it, that small letter D. Suddenly, the coin deserves a second look. Stories sometimes attach extraordinary figures, such as $67 million, to unusual 1982D Lincoln cents. But that figure must be treated as a claimed or hypothetical valuation, not as the established value of an ordinary 1982D penny. The fascinating part isn't simply the number. It's a question behind it. What can make one 1982D cent meaningfully different from another? To understand that mystery, we have to return to a year when the Lincoln cent itself was changing. In 1982, the United States Mint was moving away from the traditional bronze composition that had defined the Lincoln cent for generations and transitioning to copper-plated zinc. That transition makes 1982 one of the most closely examined years in modern Lincoln cent collecting. And when you add the Denver Mint into the story, the investigation becomes even more interesting. The first thing to remember is that a D mint mark means the coin was struck at the Denver Mint. It doesn't automatically mean the penny is rare. Millions of ordinary coins carry mint marks. But collectors know that a date combined with a particular mint can sometimes create a specialized collecting opportunity, especially when a year itself contains multiple varieties and compositions. That is why the 1982D should not be judged by appearance alone. You have to investigate it. Start with the date. Under good lighting, examine each digit in 1982. Look for unusual shapes, doubling, spacing, or characteristics that appear consistent with a known variety. Don't mistake scratches or dents for mint-made features. A coin can pick up countless marks after leaving the mint, especially after years of circulation. Next, Move your attention downward. There it is, the D mint mark. Study its shape and position, but don't assume that an unusual-looking mint mark automatically means an error. Modern collectors know that genuine varieties need to be identified against reliable references and, when necessary, authenticated. The real question is not, does this look strange? The real question is, can I prove why it looks strange? That difference separates careful numismatic research from internet speculation. And this is where the 1982D story becomes particularly intriguing. Because 1982 was a transition year, collectors may want to know whether their coin is bronze or copper-plated zinc. A scale can help. A typical bronze cent weighs approximately 3.11 grams, while a copper-plated zinc cent weighs approximately 2.50 grams. That difference is significant enough to make weighing a useful first step. But don't stop there. Scales can be inaccurate, coins can accumulate dirt, and damaged pieces can create misleading results. Weight is evidence, not a verdict. If you have a 1982D cent, weigh it carefully, record the result, and compare it with trusted numismatic information. If the coin appears to fall into an unusual category, that's when the investigation becomes more serious. Think about how remarkable it is that a tiny penny can preserve evidence of a major manufacturing transition. During 1982, the mint had to produce cents while dealing with changing economics and production requirements. The familiar Lincoln design remained, but beneath that familiar appearance, the metal itself was changing. To someone spending the coin at a store, there was no reason to care. A penny was a penny. But to collectors decades later, that difference can become the beginning of a fascinating story. Perhaps that's why older viewers often have a special connection to coins. You may remember when a penny could buy something meaningful, when children saved every cent in a glass jar, or when your parents kept loose change in a dish near the kitchen door. Maybe you remember visiting a neighborhood store and receiving a handful of coins as change. Those pennies seemed insignificant then. Today, they can become tiny time capsules. The 1982D is especially interesting because it sits directly inside that transition period. But remember, rarity is not created simply because a coin is old. A 1982 coin is not ancient. Its importance comes from its production history, possible varieties, composition, condition, and collector demand. Condition can make a tremendous difference. Look at the surfaces. Are Lincoln's portrait and lettering sharply defined? Is the original luster still present? Are there scratches across the fields? Has the coin been cleaned? Cleaning is particularly important because an aggressively cleaned coin may appear bright, but lose the natural surfaces collectors value. If you find a promising example, resist the temptation to polish it. Leave the coin exactly as you found it and document it carefully. Now look at the reverse. Examine the lettering, the shield, the rim, and the overall strike. Search for anything that appears unusual. But remember the rule we've followed throughout this journey: don't invent the error. If you see something strange, investigate it. Compare it with known varieties. Get another opinion. A genuine mint error or recognized variety needs evidence. This matters because online coin stories can sometimes take a fascinating possibility and turn it into an absolute promise. A headline might say a penny is worth millions, but headlines aren't authentication. A claimed $67 million valuation for a 1982D Lincoln penny should therefore be viewed with skepticism unless supported by verifiable documentation, a recognized variety, exceptional condition, and credible market evidence. Still, the search itself is worthwhile. Imagine opening an old family collection and finding 3 or 4 1982 cents together. One has no mint mark. Another has a D. One weighs differently from the others. Suddenly, you aren't simply looking at pennies. You're looking at evidence from a year when the composition of American cents was changing. And now you have a real collecting puzzle. Which one is bronze? Which one is copper-plated zinc? Are there different date varieties? Is one unusually preserved? Is any unusual feature actually a mint-made variety, or is it simply damage from 40 years of circulation? Those are the questions that make numismatics exciting. And perhaps the most important lesson is that you don't need expensive equipment to begin. Good lighting, a reliable scale, a magnifying glass, patience, and trustworthy references can take you surprisingly far. If you find a 1982D, place it beside another 1982 cent and compare them side by side. Look at the weight. Look at the date. Look at the surfaces. Look at the color. Look at the mint mark. Sometimes the differences become easier to understand when two coins are sitting next to each other rather than being examined separately. And if something still doesn't make sense, don't force an answer. Mystery is part of collecting. Preserve the coin and continue researching. Because the most valuable thing you may discover is not a huge price tag. It is the knowledge of exactly what you have. The 1982D Lincoln penny reminds us that American coinage history isn't always written in large letters. Sometimes it is hidden inside a tiny piece of metal, beneath a date, beside a single letter, waiting for someone to notice. So before you empty that old coin jar, before you roll those pennies for the bank, and before you spend a handful of cents sitting in an inherited collection, take another look. Search for 1982. Search for the D mint mark. Check the weight. Examine the condition. And most importantly, keep your expectations realistic while keeping your curiosity alive. Because that is the true treasure of collecting. A coin can be ordinary in a marketplace and still be extraordinary in the story it tells. And if this 1982D has taught us anything, it is that sometimes the smallest clue can completely change the way you see a familiar coin. So keep looking, keep learning, and keep those old pennies safe. Somewhere in a drawer, a jar, or a forgotten